A monumental new biography of Thomas Edison is set to be released this week. The author is one of the greatest nonfiction writers of our time, Edmund Morris, who died this May at the age of 78, just after the book was finished. Edison, a colossal work of research and writing, is a raw and unflinching look at a man whose inventions have shaped nearly every aspect of modern life. It is also a stirring final act from Edmund Morris. Walking through the Thomas Edison National Historical Park is a trip back in time. Machines commissioned by a mind that produced the greatest inventions in history: the motion picture camera, the light bulb, the phonograph.
That's insane. It's more than 100 years old, right?
It is almost incredible to think about what Thomas Edison accomplished. What Edmund Morris does is explain how and why.
What Edmund accomplished is amazing because there are more than 5 million documents in the Edison archives here in West Orange. And Edmund mastered this body of material, both published and unpublished.
Leonard DeGraff is the archivist at Edison's West Orange lab. His team worked closely with Morris to make sure the author had access to everything.
From the laboratory of T.A. Edison.
The archives.
This is where he figured out the light bulb. Oh my gosh, look at that.
His custom tools.
This was Edison's Home Depot.
Basically, yeah.
Even the contents of Thomas Edison's personal desk inside his lavish library.
Important visitors would come in here. Mark Twain was actually in this room with Edison in 1888.
DeGraff says this facility set the template for how innovation takes place in America. Team-based research and development, which companies like Google and other tech giants use today.
I would argue that the Research and Development Laboratory is his most important invention.
Not the light bulb.
No.
That's pretty fascinating to hear.
No question about it.
Edison led it all with a punishing schedule, often working 50-hour stretches, sometimes napping on his workbench for short breaks. That routine had consequences. The personal side of Thomas Edison has never been examined the way Morris does it.
What does Edmund Morris explain about the Thomas Edison story that hasn't been explained before?
Edmund is able to convey the true nature of who Edison was as a person in a way that reveals the aspects of his character that are less favorable. He could be cold. Edison could be cruel.
Edison had very difficult relationships with his 6 kids and both his first and second wife, in part because he was almost never home. The complications of the man in full became the last work of one of the world's great biographers.
His passing was sudden.
Very sudden, yes. And I think in our entire marriage, he only had 2 colds.
Sylvia Jukes Morris is Edmund Morris's widow, an accomplished biographer herself. The bound galleys of the Edison book had just arrived this spring when Edmund Morris collapsed inside the couple's home in Connecticut.
And all of a sudden I hear this bang, and I look up. He's not in the chair. And I said, "Oh, darling," I called out, "Did you trip?" And I rushed over and found him on the floor, and I picked up his head, and he said, "Oh, a stroke, just like my father had." And then it slurred his voice at the end of the sentence, closed his eyes, and he died the following evening.
Sylvia Jukes Morris has left her husband's desk largely untouched. The books he was using at the time, his famous glasses, hanging on the wall, a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. Morris's first biography, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, won him the Pulitzer Prize. It was the first in a 3-part series on Roosevelt that stretched 1,000 pages longer than War and Peace. A remarkable accomplishment for a man who, up until his early 30s, was working as an advertising executive. Morris went on to write about Ronald Reagan's life, with unprecedented access to the 40th president.
This serves to introduce Edmund Morris, who's been authorized to write the president's biography. My husband and I have full confidence in Mr. Morris as historian and scholar, and ask that you give him every assistance in his research. It's from Nancy Reagan.
But that book, Dutch, was heavily criticized after Morris invented a fictional character to move alongside Reagan and tell his story. In an interview on 60 Minutes in 1999, Morris talked about his opinion of Reagan.
I do not hide the fact that Reagan was frequently an old, spaced-out man, inattentive to details. I do not disguise the fact that he was boring in private.
Now, that book was so controversial. How does all that sit with you, and how did it sit with him?
He'd probably tell you it was his favorite book.
He would.
Because he wanted to do something different, you see. He said biography was so stick in the mud in a way. It was sort of birth to death, and that, of course, got the critics very exercised.
What did you think of that idea when he first said it to you?
Well, at first I was horrified, of course.
As this new book is published, it will become clear Edmund Morris was not done shaking up the world of biographies. This time, he starts the book at the back and finishes with Edison as a child, a sort of Benjamin Button tale.
That's another thing we had words about. I
Really?
said, you don't think you had enough trouble over Dutch, I said.
And now you're going to do this.
Now you're going to write a book backwards? I said, oh, that's great. But he just liked challenges. He liked to be different. He was a little bit of a maverick in that way.
It doesn't paint a very flattering picture of Edison
As a person. No, because those people who are going to achieve anything have got to sacrifice a lot of their personal life.
Do you think that's sad, or do you think Edison didn't care?
I think it's inevitable.
This is all Edison here.
This is all Edison, yes.
It really is incredible.
Edmund Morris spent 7 years researching and wrestling with every detail of Thomas Edison's life. It is illuminating, extensive, and a memorable final contribution from an author who will one day have books written about him.
What is Edmund's legacy?
I think his legacy will be, A, he was a great biographer, but also he was willing to do something original that hadn't been done before. I think that would be his greatest pride in his work.
And I want to thank Sylvia Jukes Morris for spending time with us. She was just so wonderful and open talking about Edmund. Obviously, it's been a very difficult year for her, but as this book is released now, there's a lot to talk about and reflect on.
Yes, I have to tell you, Edison has been, I've admired him for two things. One, he was a great scientist, open-minded, hired an African-American man because he bested him in his invention of the light bulb. He made it even better. And so Lewis Latimer is a known patenter and is now known to all of mankind.
It was all about the team with Edison, and that's the approach that we have to that team-based approach.
Yeah.